qu'on lui a donné. Mets-toi à l'intérieur. Non, à l'extérieur, à l'extérieur. Ouais, c'est bon. Freine, 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 freine. Oh là non, Seb. She put Seb out. No. No, we can't do this. We can't do this.
Hey guys, Dre here, back at it once again for a brand new video for you, and welcome to my Stryian, or Austria 2 Hybrid Boogaloo video review. And we'll get into the Stryian Grand Prix itself, Lewis Hamilton winning in completely dominant fashion, a good idea of how the field is forming, and yet another unmitigated disaster for Ferrari. Stop me if you've heard that one before. Let's get into it. Let's review the Stryian Grand Prix. I'm going to be that guy and talk about race one more time. Forgive me on this, I have to mention this, like, there is no way of getting around it, but I've got to be that guy here. This was interesting because, like, Formula 1 had the same end racism banner all over the track. They were all wearing t-shirts again. They had the same end racism ticker tape at the front of the grid next to where the drivers are standing for the national anthem. And they did it again. They took a knee before the race. What I found interesting this time, and there's two things I find interesting about this. Number one, 16 drivers took a knee this time rather than 14. I believe it was Carlos Sainz and Antonio Giovinazzi who didn't take a knee last time, who did this time. Again, I would love to ask the question, what changed between this week and last week? Last week you stood up, you ignored 12 of your other drivers taking a knee. This week you did. What was the difference? Like, honestly, what changed in the 7 days in between last week's protest and this week's protest? Like, I'd love to know what was going on there. I know it's since been revealed since last week's video that in Danil Kvyat's case, it's genuinely a cultural reason. I think Russia takes a lot of offense to the knee or taking a knee in their country. So that's one thing I can kind of understand to an extent. This was a bad look. It was a bad look last week. I'd argue it's an even worse look this week. One reason is because drivers are being wishy-washy on their stance on the matter. If Carlos Sainz and Antonio Giovinazzi, again, took a knee this week but couldn't do it last week. And then the World Feed TV directors cut away from the protest early to feature some fucking skydivers. What are we doing here? How do you get that so wrong? I don't understand it. It was really frustrating because apparently, according to Toto Wolff, the Mercedes team as a whole took a knee. And it wasn't even shown on the broadcast. Simon Lazenby, who's the anchor for Sky Sports F1 in the UK, he's been an F1 anchor as far as I can remember since the very start in 2012. He's been doing this 8 years. He's normally the anchor equivalent of a stick of celery. Like, he's just there. He's completely inoffensive. He's not bad. He just happens to be there. He's not special as far as I'm concerned as a broadcaster and as a lead anchor. He was the guy that had to illustrate on Sky Sports F1 how important it was that the message was not lost, and that how important it was to continue putting the pressure on people, and that this can't be a trend or an overnight fad. And I, generally speaking, have had to applaud Sky Sports because they've let a lot of their broadcasters go out of their way to use the platforms they've got to speak about privilege, to speak about Black Lives Matter, to speak about racial injustice. In the cricket world, we saw cricket. They had all of the players and staff in the England-West Indies Test match take a knee before the game, and they produced a special segment like with Michael Holding and Ebony Rainford Brent talking about racism within cricket and the culture of the sport. It's gone viral. The original video has been seen by over 5 million people. So I'm glad that Lazenby got the chance to speak out and then shut up and listen when other people are talking about the subject. But If Simon Lazenby has to point this out, there is a problem with your broadcast, and I found it a bit embarrassing that something so important was glossed over for a skydiver, and I still have more questions about the paddock as to why they can't seem to agree on one unified message. The whole point about Sainz and Giovinazzi I want to make clear, because I compare it one more time to the Bubba Wallace situation, not so much for pushing the car out, but Richard Petty, who stood by his driver at the end of that protest, wanted to go down and hug his driver. I mentioned 82-year-old man in the middle of a global pandemic with cases exploding in the United States left, right and centre, right? 3 years ago he was threatening to fire people for taking the knee against the anthem, and then 2.5 years later he's standing by Bubba Wallace Jr. and standing by his driver. What changed? If I was in the paddock, I would have loved to have asked Carlos Sainz and Antonio Giovinazzi, you didn't take a knee last week, you did this week. Why? It's very, very confusing, very annoying, and it sends out a mixed message from Formula 1 when other sports have had no problem showing a unified front. It's embarrassing, and they need to do better. Once again, it's had to come down to Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes to lead the charge. Hamilton, after winning the race, raised his fist, a reminiscent reminder of John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the Olympic Games, who did the same thing all those years ago to protest, as a protest to promote the treatment of black people to be treated equally. They did that at the Olympics. And we had Stephanie Travers collect the Constructors' Trophy for Mercedes. First of all, she's one of, I believe, only 9 women who have ever received the Constructors' Trophy on a podium. And as she is Zimbabwean born, she is the first black woman in the history of the sport to be on an F1 podium to collect the Constructors' Trophy. A powerful gesture from Mercedes, and Hamilton once again held the grid and the paddock to account, saying teams need to show more commitment to the cause. Let's not forget, as of July 13, as I'm recording this video, Mercedes are the only team in the paddock to have committed to increasing diversity within its own ranks, and they're the only team to have openly and publicly admitted the makeup of their team in terms of race and diversity. It's a bit embarrassing that only one team seems to have gotten the message out of 10. Just saying. Anyway, speaking of disasters, Ferrari. Oh, Ferrari. Here we go again. This was embarrassing. It was an embarrassing weekend in general for Ferrari. This was meant to be the weekend they were going to fix a lot of their problems with their aerodynamically inefficient car. You could make the argument it might have actually made it worse. Vettel talked about how they only towards the end of FP2 had got the car feeling in a similar spot to where it was last week before the race, where Vettel was handing in a bucking Bronco as far as he was concerned. Leclerc got knocked out in Q2. Again, the drivability of the Ferrari clearly was not great. He was a little bit caught out by heavier rain towards the end of Q2, but Leclerc qualified in 11th. He was knocked down to 14th with a 3-place grid penalty after blocking Daniil Kvyat during said qualifying session, and Sebastian Vettel did barely make Q3 in 10th place, but then was completely nowhere in Q3, did not trouble the timing screens whatsoever. And it was a session where Lewis Hamilton completely dunked on the field. He out-qualified everybody by 1.2 seconds in an unbelievable qualifying lap. And then, of course, we saw what happened at Turn 1. The Ferraris collided. Charles Leclerc completely goes from a long way back on the opening lap. They tries to go 4 wide into Turn 3. It was never going to work. That hole was always going to close. He plows into the side of his teammate and takes both cars out of the race. Embarrassing. A completely reckless and dumb move by Charles Leclerc. Look, I know you're starting 14th. I know you're desperate, and I know Vettel had a piss-poor start, right? I get it, to a degree. But you're never going to win a race on lap 1, but you sure as hell can lose a race on lap 1. And Charles should have backed out of that move by a country mile. He was way too back too far back. It was never going to work in a month of Sundays. And he completely ruined his team's weekend, and he might have actually ruined part of Hungary next week for them as well, because the floor upgrade they put on Charles Leclerc's car is now null and void, and they had no testing space on it now because Charles Leclerc didn't make it past lap 5 during that race. Humiliating. Now, in all fairness to Charles, he completely owned up to it. He took full accountability for the incident. He got it completely wrong, and he owned it. And I'm glad he owned it, because he didn't really have a leg to stand on otherwise. Vettel apparently left the track in a huff. Can't say I blame him on that one. I'm enjoying heel turn Sebastian Vettel as far as I'm concerned. And that's just it. If Vettel was the one that was involved in this incident, we would have raked him over the coals. We would have completely buried him, put it down to another Vettel spin, another Vettel racecraft misjudgment, you know, thrown him under the bus. And just said, yeah, Vettel's cooked, he's washed, etc., etc. All the Charles Leclerc fans on Twitter very, very silent when his boy also screws the pooch. And this is the problem. I think Charles Leclerc is a victim of what I like to call Quartararo syndrome, where it's not so much that Leclerc is or isn't great. I think he's the number 3 driver in the field right now, pound for pound. But I think we've lost some of the context as which to evaluate him as a driver. Quartararo is an example of this in MotoGP. Last year, he was, I think, 5th in the championship. He had 6 pole positions. Great job. A lot of people were hailing him as the future Marc Marquez stopper. Maybe as a title threat to Marc Marquez in the future. If you're evaluating Fabio in the context of a young rookie upstart, he was brilliant. If you're evaluating Quartararo in the context of a title challenger, you can also say he had 6 pole positions, but he didn't convert a single one of them into an actual victory. And that's a problem. So I think we're now in that stage where a lot of people still want to evaluate Charles as this young, talented, hotshot rookie, and that gives him a little bit of a pass for certain errors like this one. Whereas I think what we should now be doing is evaluating Charles in the context of, he's a future world champion, allegedly, and, you know, you want to make out that this guy is going to be a threat to win world championships in the future. Maybe not this year, given the state of Ferrari's car, which, by all accounts, is pretty piss poor. But we're now evaluating him as one of the best racing drivers in the world, and I don't think we're doing that yet. Are we ready to have that conversation? Are we ready to start evaluating Charles not as a hotshot, but as a genuine elite level driver in the field? Because if we're doing that, Charles was monumentally stupid yesterday. And that's what I call Quartararo syndrome. It's the lack of context when it comes to driver evaluation and moving those goalposts in a way that's more convenient depending on how you feel about Charles as a driver. And that's something that I think we as fans, media, and as an audience needs to figure out. The more embarrassing statistic from this weekend, there was not a Ferrari in the top 8 of any session in Austria this weekend. Good luck in Hungary, fellas. You're probably going to need it. I mean, the other interesting part of this Stryian Grand Prix weekend was that this was a much more conventional bog-standard Grand Prix. So we didn't have 3 safety cars bunch up the field. We didn't have a bunch of strategic up and downs to, you know, necessarily alter the state of play of the field. We actually got a much better representation of where the field is at. Except for one. Mercs clearly have the best car in the field right now, comfortably. Lewis Hamilton won this race at 60%. He was not challenged, he was not threatened by Max Verstappen at any point during the course of the Grand Prix. He always looked comfortable. Verstappen was brilliant in second, even after, he finished third in the end, sorry. But he was running second for 2/3 of the Grand Prix and then picked up front wing damage with a piece of his end plate hanging off the side of the car. And that did his number in over the course of the race, and Bottas was able to pass him with a handful of laps to go. Now, the issue with this is that you look at Verstappen and you think, yeah, he was brilliant yesterday for the most part. Alex Albon at one point was 40 seconds behind Verstappen on track. And I hate to be that guy and throw a young driver like Albon under the bus, but it is alarming that Verstappen was half a lap better than Albon over the course of 50 laps of the Grand Prix. Obviously, that gap was brought in not only by Verstappen's front wing damage, but also by the fact he took a free pit stop at the end of the Grand Prix to try and get the point for fastest lap. So obviously that brought them closer together by the end of the Grand Prix. But point is that Verstappen was one pit stop and a half better than Albon over the majority of a Grand Prix. That's alarming. So what's the yardstick for Red Bull? Is the representation of the performance of the car nearer Verstappen's end? Or is it near Albon's end? We don't know. The driver quality is so far apart that it's almost impossible to evaluate where that Red Bull is in the state of the field. Especially where in the second half of that Grand Prix, we had Sergio Perez was probably the fastest man on track in the Racing Point car. Racing Point. Let me get that right. But Perez, at multiple fastest laps in the second half of the race, was gunning down Albon at nearly a second a lap, and the delta just wasn't quite big enough to be able to pass him on track. He tried with a couple to go, and then got caught doing the Hamilton pit maneuver we saw from last week, where he hits the side of Albon's car trying to pass at turn 4. And this time, Albon comes off the better of it. Perez breaks his front wing and then drops through the field at the end because of all the time lost. So, it was a messy one, but it looks like we have a better idea of the state of play amongst the field, apart from where Ferrari fits in. Leclerc openly admitted last week it was the drive of his life to even finish in second. That's the mystery. Where does Ferrari fit into this? Because it's looking like it's Mercedes, Red Bull, maybe Racing Point third, possibly Ferrari fourth, possibly McLaren fifth. Because McLaren didn't really factor in the majority of this race. They were down in the midfield, deep in the midfield, like minor points for 65-70% of the race. Came alive at the end when Carlos Sainz got out of the way for Lando Norris to charge at, Stroll and Ricciardo, and eventually Perez due to the front wing damage. And my God, Lando Norris's box office. Like, for the second race in a row, he pulls off ridiculous last lap incidents where Stroll and Ricciardo are fighting. Again, Perez is losing bucket loads of time due to his broken front wing. And Perez is just trying to nurse the car home because he doesn't want to go in the pits and lose 25 seconds for a new front wing. Norris clears Stroll, clears Ricciardo, and then passes Sergio Perez at the final corner of the last lap to take 5th place. It was a stunning comeback. And Norris, her guy who got the fake news controversies towards the end of last year of not being excited on track and, quote, averaging less than 0.7 overtakes a race, which was never actually statistically proven to be true. Now Norris is genuinely one of the best-looking guys in the first 2 races of the season and might be the most entertaining driver in the paddock right now. The man's doing brilliant work, and given that this was a sport that was struggling to look for a post-Hamilton/Button British star, we have one in Lando. George Russell had a shout out to him as well because he qualified in 11th place for Williams after 23 attempts. He finally made a Q2 and qualified in 11th place after penalties were factored in. There is hope, and that is definitely a positive. But that last end fight between Ricciardo, Stroll, Norris and Perez was bonkers. It was the highlight of the Grand Prix, and I can't wait to see more of that going forward because it looks like the Racing Points, the Renaults, and McLarens are kind of in the same sort of ballpark right now, dependent on strategy and overall pace. Although Perez was outstanding until that incident at the end of the Grand Prix. So I look forward to seeing how this plays out in Hungary, especially given it's a track where you can't really pass people on that sort of level. Looking forward to seeing more. So, how do I score this race overall? I'll say this off the bat. This wasn't quite as hectic or chaotic as last week's Austrian Grand Prix, but this was a good conventional motorsport race. It was pretty quiet for the first 2/3, but it peaked up in... King made this point on Twitter to me. It peaked up in a crescendo. It peaked at the end, which is exactly what you're kind of hoping for, because we had Bottas versus Verstappen for second, and we had the chaos in the upper midfield between Perez, Albon, Stroll, Ricciardo and Norris, and that led to some genuinely good, great racing. 2 brilliant overtakes when Verstappen got back round the outside of Bottas at turn 4, and then Sergio Perez going round the outside at turn 6. 2 outstanding passes, some genuinely high drama at the end of the Grand Prix. I'm going to score this a 7 out of 10. It was a pretty darn good Grand Prix, all things considered. To get higher than a 7, you've really got to have like major shenanigans or have much more consistent action throughout the Grand Prix. And that doesn't happen very often. But overall, about as good as a conventional Grand Prix can get. I think this sport still has some issues with dirty air and running under green flags, but for the most part, not bad. I enjoyed it very much. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments of Ferrari, of the racial protest, anything else that comes into your mind, and I'll sound off in the comments when you're done. Thank you all very much for watching. Talk to you guys soon, and yeah. Sayonara.